Hello, welcome back. I hope everyone watching this has seen the first part, or I guess if you've read 1984 recently, then I guess you won't need to have seen my reading of it, but I want to get through as much of this as possible on stream, so I'm going to not... Oh, hello, Tail. Tail features in the chat. I'm going to not give you much of an introduction. Let's just get right into it and continue with Chapter 3. And I'll just keep my chat here so I can see it. And now I've just hidden it again. Alright, let's just sort this out. I organised this beforehand, then there was a flaw in my plan. Okay. Chapter 3. Winston was dreaming of his mother. He must, he thought, have been 10 or 11 years old when his mother had disappeared. She was a tall, statuesque, rather silent woman, with slow movements and magnificent fair hair. His father had remembered more vaguely as dark and thin, dressed always in neat, dark clothes. Winston remembered especially the very thin soles of his father's shoes, and wearing spectacles. The two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first great purges of the 50s. At this moment his mother was sitting in some place deep down beneath him, with his young sister in his arms. He did not remember his sister at all, except as a tiny, feeble baby, always silent, with large, watchful eyes. Both of them were looking up at him. They were down in some subterranean place, the bottom of a well, for instance, or a very deep grave. But it was a place which, already far below him, was itself moving downwards. They were in the saloon of the sinking ship, looking up at him through the darkening water. There was still air in the saloon, they could still see him and he them, but all the while they were sinking down into the green waters which in another moment must hide them forever from sight. He was out in the light and air while they were being sucked down to death, and they were down there because he was up here. He knew it and they knew it, and he could see the knowledge in their faces. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts, only the knowledge that they must die in order that he might remain alive, and that this was part of the unavoidable order of things. He could not remember what had happened, but he knew in his dream that in some way the lives of his mother and sister had been sacrificed to his own. It was one of those dreams which, while retaining the characteristic dream scenery, are a continuation of one's intellectual life, and in which one becomes aware of facts and ideas which still seem new and valuable after one is awake. The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death, nearly 30 years ago, had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragedy, he perceived, belonged to the ancient time, to a time when there was still privacy, love, and friendship, and when the members of his family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. His mother's memory tore at his heart because she died loving him when he was too young and selfish to love her in return, and because somehow, he did not remember how, she had sacrificed herself to a conception of loyalty that was private and unalterable. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there were fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion, no deep or complex sorrows. All this he seemed to see in his large eyes of his mother and his sister, looking up at him through the green water hundreds of fathoms down and still sinking. Suddenly he was standing on short, springy turf, on a summer evening when the slanting rays of the sun gilded to the ground. The landscape that he was looking at recurred so often in his dreams that he was never fully certain whether or not he had seen it in the real world. In his waking thoughts he called it the Golden Country. It was an old, rabbit-bitten pasture, with the foot track wandering across it, and a molehill here and there. In the ragged hedge on the opposite side of the field, the boughs of the elm trees were swaying very faintly in the breeze, their leaves just stirring in the dense masses like women's hair. Somewhere near at hand, though out of sight, there was a clear, slowing moving stream, where dace were swimming in the pools under the willow trees. The girl with dark hair was coming towards them across the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was the admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm. That too was a gesture belonging to the ancient time. Winston woke up with the words Shakespeare on his lips. The telescreen was giving forth an ear-splitting whistle which continued on the same note for 30 seconds. It was 07:15, getting up time for the office workers. Winston wrenched his body out of bed, naked, for a member of the outer party received only 3,000 clothing coupons annually, and a suit of pajamas was 600, and seized the dingy singlet and a pair of shorts that were lying across the chair. The physical jerks would begin in 3 minutes. The next moment he was doubled up by a violent coughing fit, which nearly always attacked him soon after waking up. It emptied his lungs so completely that he could only begin breathing again by lying on his back and taking a series of deep gasps. His veins had swelled with the effort of the cough, and the varicose ulcer had started itching. 30 to 40 group, yapped a piercing female voice. 30 to 40 group, take your places, please. 30s to 40s. Winston sprang to attention in front of the telescreen, upon which the image of a youngish woman, scrawny but muscular, dressed in tunic and gym shoes, had already appeared. Yes, I'm keeping an eye on the chat, those of you asking. Arms bending and stretching, she rapped out. Take your time by me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, comrades, put a little bit of life into it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The pain of the coughing fit had not quite driven out of Winston's mind the impression made by his dream, and the rhythmic movements of the exercise restored it somewhat. As he mechanically shot his arms back and forth, wearing on his face the look of grim enjoyment which was considered proper during the physical jerks. He was struggling to think his way backward into the dim period of his early childhood. It was extraordinarily difficult. Beyond the late 50s, everything faded. When there was no external records that you could refer to, even the outline of your own life lost its sharpness. You remembered huge events which had quite probably not happened. You remembered the detail of incidents without being able to recapture their atmosphere, and there were long blank periods to which you could assign nothing. Everything had been different then. Even the names of countries and their shapes on the map had been different. Airstrip 1, for instance, had not been called that in those days. It had been called England or Britain or London. He felt fairly certain it had always been called London. Winston could definitely remember a time when his country had not been at war, but it was evident that there had been a fairly long interval of peace during his childhood, because one of his early memories was of an air raid which appeared to take everyone by surprise. Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester. He did not remember the raid itself, but he did remember his father's hand clutching his own as they hurried down, 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 into some place deep beneath the earth. Round and round a spiral staircase which ran under his feet, and which finally so wearied his legs that he began whimpering, and they had to stop and rest. His mother, in her slow, dreamy way, was following a long way behind them. She was carrying his baby sister, or perhaps it was only a bundle of blankets that she was carrying. He was not certain whether his sister had been born then. Finally they had emerged into a noisy, crowded place, which he had realized to be the tube station. There were people sitting all over the stone-flagged floor, and other people, packed tightly together, were sitting on metal bunks, one above the other. Winston and his mother and father found themselves a place on the floor, and near them an old man and a woman were sitting side by side on the bunk. The old man had a decent dark suit, and a black cloth cap pushed back from very white hair. His face was scarlet and his eyes were blue and full of tears. He reeked of gin. He seemed to breathe out of his skin in place of sweat, and one could have fancied that the tears welling from his eyes were pure gin. But though slightly drunk, he was also suffering under some grief that was genuine and unbearable. In his childish way, Winston grasped that some terrible thing, something that was beyond forgiveness, that could never be remedied, had just happened. It also seemed to him that he knew that what it was. Someone whom the old man loved, a little granddaughter perhaps, had been killed. Every few minutes the old man kept repeating, "We didn't ought to have trusted 'em. I said so. Ma, didn't I? That's what comes of trusting 'em. I said so all along. We didn't ought to have trusted the buggers." But which buggers they didn't ought to have trusted, Winston could not now remember. Since about that time, war had been literally continuous. Though strictly speaking, it had not always been the same war. For several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself, some of which he remembered vividly. But to trace out the history of the whole period, to say who was fighting whom at any given moment, would have been utterly impossible, since no written record and no spoken word ever made mention of any other alignment than the existing one. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was 1984, Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In no public or private utterance was it ever admitted that three powers had at any time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia, but that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia, therefore Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. The frightening thing, he reflected for the 10,000th time as he forced his shoulders painfully backwards, with his hands on his hips. They were gyrating their bodies from the waist, an exercise that was supposedly good for the back muscles. The frightening thing was that it might all be true. If the party could thrust its hand into the past and say of this or that event, "It never happened," that surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was the unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. In newspeak, doublethink. Got a super chat from Stephen Wheeler. When I was in grade 7, this book was required reading. My younger cousins have told me that the book is no longer required reading by the schools, nor is Animal Farm. Yeah, it was never required reading, nor is Animal Farm for me. At my school, I read it because I heard it was good, and I wanted to appear like an intellectual who'd read books that were supposed to be important. So, yeah, it was never required reading. There's actually a good joke in the show Community where the character Britta, who's a kind of she's a bit of an SJW political activist. She meets a guy who she likes, and the guy, he like quotes 1984 or something, and she says I think he says 1984, I love that book. I think children should be forced to read it. And Britta says, yeah, me too. So yeah, it's a good book, and I'm not saying that. It is a little bit ironic to say that children should be forced to read it, though, to be honest. Stand easy, barked the instructress a little more genially. Winston sank his arms to his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. His mind slid away into the labyrinthine world of doublethink. To know and not to know. To be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. To hold simultaneously two opinions which cancelled out, knowing them to be contradictory, and believing in both of them. To use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it. To believe that democracy was impossible, and that the party was the guardian of democracy. To forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety, consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. The instructress had called them to attention again. "And now, let's see which of us can touch our toes," she said enthusiastically. "Right over from the hips, please, comrades. 1, 2. 1, 2. Winston loathed this exercise, which sent shooting pains all the way from his heels to his buttocks, and often ended by bringing on another coughing fit. The half-pleasant quality went out of his meditations. The past, he reflected, had not merely been altered, it had been actually destroyed. For how could you establish even the most obvious fact when there existed no record outside of your own memory? He tried to remember in what year he had first heard the mention of Big Brother. He thought it must have been at some time in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. In the party histories, of course, Big Brother figured as the leader and guardian of the revolution since its very earliest days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backwards in time until already they extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and the 30s. When the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London in great gleaming motor cars or horse carriages with glass sides. There was no knowing how much of this legend was true and how much invented. Winston could not even remember at what date the party itself had come into existence. He did not believe he had ever heard the word ingsoc before 1960, but it was possible that in its old-speak form, English socialism, that is to say, it had been current earlier. Everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could put your finger on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, it was claimed in the party history books that the party had invented aeroplanes. He remembered aeroplanes since his earliest childhood, but you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once in his whole life he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof of the falsification of an historical fact, and on that occasion... "Smith!" screamed the shrewdish voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Yes, you! Bend lower, please. You can do better than that. You're not trying. Lower, please. Yes, that's better, comrade. Now stand at ease, the whole squad, and watch me." A sudden hot sweat had broken out all over Winston's body. His face remained completely inscrutable. Never show dismay, never show resentment. A single flicker of the eyes could give you away. He stood watching while the instructress raised her arms above her head and, one could not say gracefully, but with remarkable neatness and efficiency, bent over and tucked the first joint of her fingers under her toes. "There, comrades! That's how I want to see you doing it. Watch me again. I'm 39 and I've had 4 children. Now look." She bent over again. "You see, my knees aren't bent. You can all do it if you want to," she added as she straightened herself up. "Anyone under 45 is perfectly capable of touching his toes. We don't all have the privilege of fighting in the front line, but at least we can all keep fit. Remember our boys on the Malabar front, and the sailors of the floating fortresses. Just think what they have to put up with. Now try again. That's better, comrade. That's much better," she added encouragingly as Winston, with a violent lunge, succeeded in touching his toes with knees unbent for the first time in several years. So he could do it. She was right. I think I need a drink. It's another hot day today. Just a second, please. No, I already made one earlier. I just need to drink it now. Yeah, I guess doublethink is one of the biggest takeaways from the book, is the sort of idea of doublethink. And I think it's if you watched my stream earlier, sorry, my stream yesterday where I started the book, I think this idea of doublethink, in its real non-fictional form, is what is so disturbing about modern day discourse. In the most recent example, not to make too big of a point of it, but in the most recent example, we can look at the reaction to the protests that have been going on for the last few weeks, particularly in America, where things have got particularly kind of violent in some places. Although we have seen violence, this week and especially yesterday in London. But anyway, at first what we were all hearing was how peaceful the protests were, how noble the protesters were, and that they were even social distancing. They were being so careful to not hurt anyone that they were keeping a distance away from each other, and they weren't hurting anyone. And then when there was some violence that broke out, it was obviously the police's fault. And if you called the protests riots, that was a racist term used to condemn the protesters. You're just making up excuses, basically. And now that the use of violence, and anarchy has, it's undeniable that there are riots going on. It's considered a good thing. We're now hearing people defending the riots, saying that using Martin Luther King's quote about riots being the language of the unheard. Whatever, the riots are good. It's good that they're rioting. This is the only way to bring on social change. And so the fact that they were calling the protesters noble and saying it was good that they weren't rioting, and that anyone who said they were rioting was just making things up, they're now saying that they've turned that over and said that it's now good that there are riots. Yes, there are riots, and it's a good thing. Let's go on to the next chapter, shall we? I don't want to get this too far off topic. Chapter 4. With the deep, unconscious sigh which not even the nearness of the telescreen could prevent him from uttering when his day's workout started, Winston pulled the speakwrite towards him, blew the dust from its mouthpiece, and put on his spectacles. Then he unrolled and clipped together 4 small cylinders of paper, which had already flopped out of the pneumatic tube on the right-hand side of the desk. In the walls of the cubicle there were 3 orifices. To the right of the speakwrite, a small pneumatic tube for writing messages. To the left, a larger one for newspapers, and in the side wall, within easy reach of Winston's arm, a large oblong slit protected by a wire grating. This last one was for disposal of waste paper. Similar slits existed in thousands or tens of thousands throughout the building, not only in every room but at short intervals in every corridor. For some reason, they were nicknamed memory holes. I didn't know that's where the word memory hole came from. That's funny. I thought that was just like a modern day invention. I didn't realize it came from this. When one knew that any document was due for destruction, or even when one saw a scrap of waste paper lying about, it was an automatic action to lift the flap of the nearest memory hole and drop it in, whereupon it would be whirled away on a current of warm air to the enormous furnaces which were hidden somewhere in the recesses of the building. Winston examined the 4 slips of paper which he had unrolled. Each contained a message of only 1 or 2 lines, and in the abbreviated jargon, not actually newspeak, but consisting largely of newspeak words, which was used in the ministry for internal purposes. They ran, Times 17/3/84 BB. Speech Marley reported. Africa rectify. Times 19/12/83 Forecasts 3 YP 4th quarter 83 Misprints verified current issue. Times 14/2/84 Mini Plenty malquoted chocolate rectify. Times 3/12/83 reporting BB. Day order double plus good refs underpersons rewrite, false wires, unsub, anti-filing. With a faint feeling of satisfaction, Winston laid the 4 messages aside. It was the intricate and responsible job he had better be dealt with last. The other 3 were routine matters, though the second one would probably mean some tedious wading through lists of figures. Winston dialed back numbers on the telescreen, and called for the appropriate issue of the Times, which slid out of the pneumatic tube after only a few minutes' delay. The messages he had received referred to articles or news items which, for one reason or another, it was thought necessary to alter, or, in the official phrase, to rectify. For example, it had appeared from the Times of the 17th of March that Big Brother, in his speech of the previous day, had predicted the South Indian front would remain quiet, but that the Eurasian offensive would shortly be launched in North Africa. As it happened, the Eurasian High Command had launched its offensive in South India and left North Africa alone. It was therefore necessary to rewrite a paragraph of Big Brother's speech in such a way as to make him predict the thing that actually happened. Or again, the Times of the 19th of December had published the official forecasts of the output of various classes of consumption goods in the 4th quarter of 1983, which was also the 6th quarter of the 9th three-year plan. Today's issue contained a statement of the actual output, from which it appeared that the forecasts were in every instance grossly wrong. Winston's job was to rectify the original figures by making them agree with the later ones, and for the third message it referred to a very simple error which could be set right in a couple of minutes. A short time ago as February, the Ministry of Plenty had issued a promise, a categorical pledge, were the official words, that there would be no reduction of the chocolate ration during 1984. Actually, as Winston was aware, the chocolate ration had been reduced from 30 grams to 20 at the end of the present week. All that was needed was to substitute for the original promise a warning that it would probably be necessary to reduce the ration at some time in April. As soon as Winston had dealt with each of the messages, he clipped his speak-written corrections to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the pneumatic tube. Then, with a movement which was as nearly as possible unconscious, he crumpled up the original messages and any notes that he himself had made, and dropped them into the memory hole to be devoured by the flames. What happened in the unseen labyrinth to which the pneumatic tube led, he did not know in detail, but he did know in general terms. As soon as all the corrections had happened to be necessary in any particular number of the Times had been assembled and collected, that number would be reprinted, the original copy destroyed, and the corrected copy placed on the files in its stead. The process of continuous alteration was applied not only to the newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs of every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. Day by day and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. In this way, every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct, nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and re-inscribed exactly as often as was necessary. In no case would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place. The largest section of the records department, far larger than the one in which Winston worked, consisted simply of persons whose duty it was to track down and collect all copies of books, newspapers, and other documents which had been superseded and were due for destruction. A number of the Times which might, because of the changes in political alignment or mistaken prophecies uttered by Big Brother, had been written a dozen times, still stood on the files bearing its original date, and no other copy existed to contradict it. Books also were recalled and rewritten again and again, and were invariably reissued without any admission that any alteration had been made. Even the written instructions which Winston received, and which he invariably got rid of as soon as he dealt with them, never stated or implied that an act of forgery was to be committed. Always the reference was to slips, errors, misprints, or misquotations which it was necessary to put right in the interest of accuracy. But actually, he thought as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for another. Most of the material that you were dealing with had no connection with anything in the real world, not even the kind of connection that is contained in a direct lie. Statistics were just as much fantasy in their original version as in the rectified version. A great deal of time you were expected to make them out of your head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of books for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given as 62 millions. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down as 57 millions, so as not to allow for the usual claim that the quota had been overfulfilled. In any case, 62 millions was not nearly the truth, was no nearer the truth than 57 millions, or than 145 millions. Very likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half of the population of Oceania went barefoot. And so it was that every class of recorded fact, great or small, everything faded away into a shadow world in which, finally, even the date of the year had become uncertain. Winston glanced across the hall. In the corresponding cubicle on the other side of a small, precise-looking, dark-chinned man named Tillotson was working steadily away, with a folded newspaper on his knee, and his mouth very close to the mouthpiece of the speakwrite. He had the air of trying to keep what he was saying a secret between himself and the telescreen. He looked up with his spectacles darted a hostile flash in Winston's direction. Winston hardly knew Tillotson, and had no idea what work he was employed on. People in the records department did not readily talk about their jobs. In the long windowless hall, with its double row of cubicles and its endless rustle of papers and hum of voices murmuring into speakwrites, there were quite a dozen people whom Winston did not even know by name, though he daily saw them hurrying to and fro in the corridors, or gesticulating in the 2 minutes hate. He knew that in the cubicle next to him the little woman with sandy hair had toiled day in and day out, simply at tracking down and deleting from the press the names of people who had been vaporized and were therefore considered never to have existed. There was a certain fitness in this, since her own husband had been vaporized a couple of years earlier, and a few cubicles away, a mild, ineffectual, dreamy creature named Aberforth, with very hairy eyes, very hairy ears, and a surprising talent for juggling with rhymes and meters, was engaged in producing garbled versions, definitive texts that they were called, of poems which had become ideologically offensive, but which, for one reason or another, were to be retained in the anthologies. And this hall, with its 50 workers or thereabouts, was only one subsection, a single cell, as it were, in the whole complexity of the records department. Beyond, above, below, were the other swarms of workers engaged in an unimaginable multitude of jobs. There were huge printing shops with their sub-editors, their typography experts, and elaborately equipped studios for faking photographs. There were teleprograms sections with its engineers, its producers, and its teams of actors specially chosen for their skill in imitating voices. There were the armies of reference clerks whose job was simply to draw up lists of books and periodicals which were due for recall. There were the vast repositories where the corrected documents were stored, and the hidden furnaces where all the original copies were destroyed. And somewhere or other, quite anonymous, there were the directing brains who coordinated the whole effort and laid down the lines of policy which made it necessary that this fragment of the past should be preserved, that one falsified, and the other one rubbed out of existence. And the records department, after all, was itself only a single branch of the Ministry of Truth, whose primary job was not to reconstruct the past, but to supply the citizens of Oceania with newspapers, films, textbooks, telescreen programs, plays, novels, with every conceivable kind of information, instruction, or entertainment, from a statue to a slogan, from a lyric poem to a biological treatise, from a child's spelling book to a newspeak dictionary. And the ministry had not only to supply the multifarious needs of the party, but also to repeat the whole operation at a lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. There was a whole chain of the separate departments dealing with proletariat literature, music, drama, and entertainment generally. Here were produced rubbishy newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime, and astrology, sensational 5-cent novelettes, films oozing with sex, and sentimental songs which are composed entirely by mechanical means, on a special kind of kaleidoscope known as a versificator. Versificator. There was even a whole subsection, pornosec it was called in newspeak, engaged in producing the lowest kind of pornography, which was sent out in sealed packets and which no party member, other than those who worked on it, was permitted to look at. 3 messages had slid out of the pneumatic tube while Winston was working, but they were simple matters, and had disposed of them before the 2 minutes of hate interrupted him. When the hate was over, he returned to his cubicle, took the newspeak dictionary from the shelf, pushed his speakwrite to one side, cleaned his spectacles, and settled down to the main job of the morning. Winston's greatest pleasure in life was in his work. Most of it was tedious routine, but included in it there was also jobs so difficult and intricate that you could lose yourself in them. Sorry, it's a motorbike going past. As in the depths of a mathematical problem, delicate pieces of forgery in which you had nothing to guide you except your knowledge of the principles of ingsoc and your estimate of what the party wanted you to say. Winston was good at this kind of thing. On occasion he had been entrusted with the rectification of the Times' leading articles, which were written entirely in newspeak. He enrolled the message that had set aside earlier. It ran, Times, 3/12/83, reporting BB, day order, double plus ungood, refs, unpersons, rewrite, full wise, up, anti-filing. In Old Speak, or in Standard English, this might be rendered, the reporting of Big Brother's order for the day in the Times of December 3rd, 1983 is extremely unsatisfactory and makes references to non-existing persons. Rewrite it in full and submit your draft to higher authority before filing. Winston read through the offending article. Big Brother's order for the day, it seemed, had been chiefly devoted to praising the work of an organization known as FFCC, which supplied cigarettes and other comforts to the sailors in the floating fortresses. A certain Comrade Withers, a prominent member of the inner party, had been singled out for special mention and awarded a decoration, the Order of Conspicuous Merit, 2nd class. 3 months later, FFCC had suddenly been dissolved with no reasons given. One could assume that Withers and his associates were now in disgrace, but there had been no report of the matter in the press or on the telescreen. That was to be expected, since it was unusual for political offenders to be put on trial or even publicly denounced. The great purges involving thousands of people, with public trials of traitors, thought criminals who... sorry, I lost my place. Thought criminals who made abject confession of their crimes and were afterwards executed, with special showpieces not occurring oftener than once in a couple of years. More commonly, people who had incurred the displeasure of the party simply disappeared, and were never heard of again. One never had the smallest clues to what had happened to them. In some cases they might not even be dead. Perhaps 30 people personally known to Winston, not counting his parents, had disappeared at one time or another. Winston stroked his nose gently with a paperclip. In the cubicle across the way, Comrade Tilston was still crouching secretively over his speakwrite. He raised his head for a moment. Again the hostile spectacle flash. Winston wondered whether Comrade Tilston was engaged on the same job as himself. It was perfectly possible. So tricky a piece of work would never be entrusted to a single person. On the other hand, to turn it over to a committee would be to admit openly that an act of fabrication was taking place. Very likely as many as a dozen people were now working on rival versions of what Big Brother had actually said, and presently some master brain in a party would select this version or that, would re-edit it and set it in motion, the complete process of cross-referencing that would be required, and then the chosen lie would pass into the permanent records and become truth. Winston did not know why Withers had been disgraced. Perhaps it was for corruption or incompetence. Perhaps Big Brother was merely getting rid of a too popular subordinate. Perhaps Withers or someone close to him had been suspected of heretical tendencies. Or perhaps, what was the likeliest of all, the thing had simply happened because purges and vaporizations were a necessary part of the mechanics of government. The only real clue lay in the words refs unpersons, which indicated that Withers was already dead. You could not invariably assume this to be the case when people were arrested. Sometimes they were released and allowed to remain at liberty for as many years as a year or two before being executed. Very occasionally some person whom had believed dead long since would make a ghostly reappearance at some public trial where he would implicate hundreds of others in his testimony before vanishing, this time forever. Withers, however, was already an unperson. He did not exist. He had never existed. Winston decided that it would not be enough simply to reverse the tendency of Big Brother's speech. It was better to make it deal with something totally unconnected with its original subject. The chat hasn't said anything for a while. Am I still streaming? Apparently there's 33 of you in there. And it says there's excellent connection, so I guess I'll keep going. Now I can't find my place again. Did I, Yeah, here we go. He might turn the speech into the usual denunciation of traitors and thought criminals, but that was a little too obvious. While to invent a victory at the front or some triumph of overproduction in the 9th 3-year plan might complicate the records too much. What was needed was a piece of pure fantasy. Suddenly there sprang into his mind, ready-made as it were, the image of a certain Comrade Ogilvy, who had recently died in battle at heroic circumstances. There were occasions when Big Brother devoted his order for the day to commemorating some humble, rank-and-file party member whose life and death had held up as an example worthy to be followed. Today he should commemorate Comrade Ogilvy. It was true that there was no such person as Comrade Ogilvy, but a few lines of print and a couple of faked photographs would soon bring him into existence. Winston thought for a moment, then pulled the speaker right towards him and began dictating in Big Brother's familiar style. A style at once military and pedantic, and, because of a trick of asking questions and then promptly answering them, "What lessons do we learn from this fact, comrades? The lesson, which is also one of the fundamental principles of INGSOC, that, etc., etc." Easy to imitate. At the age of 3, Comrade Ogilvy had refused all toys except a drum, a submachine gun, and a model helicopter. At 6, a year earlier, by a special relaxation of the rules, he had joined the spies. At 9, he had been a troop leader. At 11, he had denounced his uncle in the thought police after overhearing a conversation which appeared to him to have criminal tendencies. At 17, he had been a district organizer for the Junior Anti-Sex League. At 19, he had designed a hand grenade which had been adopted by the Ministry of Peace, and which, in its first trial, had killed 31 Eurasian prisoners in one burst. At 23, he had perished in action, pursued by enemy jet planes while flying over the Indian Ocean, with important dispatches. He had weighted his body with his machine gun and leapt out of his helicopter into deep water, dispatches and all, an end, said Big Brother, which was impossible to contemplate without feelings of envy. Big Brother added a few remarks on the purity and single-mindedness of Comrade Ogilvy's life. He was a total abstainer and non-smoker, and no recreations except daily hour in the gymnasium, and had taken a vow of celibacy, believing marriage and the care of family to be incompatible with 24 hour a day devotion to duty. He had no subjects of conversation except his principles of ingsoc, and no aim in life except the defeat of the Eurasian army and the hunting down of spies, saboteurs, thought criminals, and traitors generally. Winston debated with himself whether to award Comrade Ogilvy the Order of Conspicuous Merit. In the end, he decided against it because of the unnecessary cross-referencing that it would entail. Once again he glanced at his rival in the opposite cubicle. Something seemed to tell him with certainty that Tillotson was busy on the same job as himself. There was no way of knowing whose job would finally be adopted, but he felt a profound conviction that it would be his own. Comrade Ogilvy, unimagined an hour ago, was now a fact. It struck him as curious that you could create dead men but not living ones. Comrade Ogilvy, who had never existed in the present, now existed in the past, and when once the act of forgery was forgotten, he would exist just as authentically, and upon the same evidence, as Charlemagne or Julius Caesar. He's getting a drink. Got a bit of a headache. I'm working on it. Don't worry guys, we'll start again in just a second. Chapter 5. In the low-ceilinged canteen, deep underground, the lunch queue jerked slowly forward. The room was already full and deafeningly noisy. Oh, sorry, I was actually going to say something about the last chapter. The Ministry of Truth and the Records Department, something I've learned since reading this the first time was about the Soviet photos that were changed to reflect current policy. I'll just find that for you because I think it's interesting. There we go. Now you can't see what I'm doing. You get to see my email address if it comes up. Yeah, so I've got it now. Oops. This is the most famous one of this chap was taken out of this photo. It's done very well considering they didn't have like Photoshop at the time. Because it helps that it's in black and white and it's a fairly plain background. But they would have had to like make a little bit of his slave here. We just want to find out who this guy was. Apparently Stalin's pockmarked face was airbrushed to make it look more handsome, I guess. Give him smooth skin. Yeah, so I'm guessing, well, I don't know when it was found out this happened, but you can imagine this would be an inspiration for 1984. It also kind of strikes me how wasteful all of this is, like all of these hundreds of people employed just for this job that aren't actually producing anything of value. They're just they're just bureaucrats working for the government who are only occupied, their full-time job is being occupied to do this completely useless and deceitful things. Anyway, that's I just thought that was worth bringing up. I'm sure you've all heard of that anyway. In the low-ceilinged canteen, deep underground, a lunch queue jerked slowly forward. The room was already very full and deafeningly noisy. From the grill on the counter, the steam of stew came pouring forth, with a sour metallic smell which did not quite overcome the fumes of Victory gin. On the far side of the room there was a small bar, a mere hole in the wall, where gin could be bought at 10 cents in the large nib. "Just the man I was looking for," said a voice at Winston's back. He turned around. It was his friend Sim, who worked with the research department. Perhaps friend was not exactly the right word. You do not have friends nowadays. You had comrades. But there were some comrades whose society was pleasanter than that of others. Sim was a philologist, a specialist in newspeak. Indeed, he was one of the enormous team of experts now engaged in compiling the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary. He was a tiny creature, smaller than Winston, with dark hair and large, protuberant eyes, at once mournful and derisive, which seemed to search your face closely while he was speaking to you. "I wanted to ask you whether you got any razor blades," he said. "Not one," said Winston, with a short, sort of guilty haste. "I've tried all over the place. They don't exist any longer." Everyone kept asking you for razor blades. Actually, he had 2 unused ones, which he was hoarding up. There had been a famine of them for months past. At any given moment there were some necessary article which the party shops were unable to supply. Sometimes it was buttons, sometimes it was darning wool, sometimes it was shoelaces. At present it was razor blades. You could only get hold of them, if at all, by scrounging more or less furtively on the free market. "I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks," he added untruthfully. The queue gave another jerk forward. As they halted, he turned and faced Sim again. Each of them took a greasy metal tray from the pile at the end of the counter. "Did you go see the prisoners hanged yesterday?" said Sim. "I was working," said Winston indifferently. "I shall see it on the flicks, I suppose." "A very inadequate substitute," said Sim. His mocking eyes roved over Winston's face. "I know you," the eyes seemed to say. "I see through you. I know very well why you didn't go see the prisoners hanged." In an intellectual way, Sim was venomously orthodox. He would talk with a disagreeable, gloating satisfaction of helicopter raids on enemy villages, and trials of confession of thought criminals. The execution in the cellars of the Ministry of Love. Talking to him was largely a matter of getting him away from such subjects and entangling him, if possible, in the technicalities of newspeak, on which he was authoritative and interesting. Winston turned his head a little aside to avoid the scrutiny of the dark eyes. "It was a good hanging," said Sim reminiscently. "I think it spoils it when they tie their feet together. I like to see them kicking. And above all, at the end, the tongue sticking right out, and blue, quite bright blue. That's the detail that appeals to me." "Next, please," yelled the white-aproned prole with the ladle. Winston and Sim pushed their trays beneath the grill. Onto each was dumped swiftly the regulation lunch, a metal pannikin of pinkish-grey stew, a hunk of bread, a cube of cheese, a mug of milkless Victory coffee, and 1 saccharine tablet. "There's a table over there, under that telescreen," said Sim. "Let's pick up a gin on the way." The gin was served out to them in handleless china mugs. They threaded their way across the crowded room and unpacked their trays onto a metal-topped table, and on one corner of which someone had left a pool of stew, a filthy liquid mess that had appearance of vomit. Winston took up his mug of gin, paused for an instant to collect his nerve, then gulped the oily-tasting stuff down. When he had winked the tears out of his eyes, he suddenly discovered that he was hungry. He began swallowing spoonfuls of the stew, which, in among its general sloppiness, had cubes of spongy pinkish stuff, which was probably the preparation of meat. Neither of them spoke again till they had emptied their pannikins. From the table at Winston's left, a little behind his back, someone was talking rapidly and continuously, a harsh gabble, almost like a quacking of a duck, which pierced the general uproar of the room. "How is the dictionary getting on?" said Winston, raising his voice to overcome the noise. "Slowly," said Sim. "I'm on the adjectives. It's fascinating." He had brightened up immediately at the mention of newspeak. He pushed his pannikin aside, took up a hunk of bread in one delicate hand and his cheese in the other, and leaned across the table so as to speak without shouting. "The 11th edition is the definitive edition," he said. "We're getting the language into its final shape, the shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. When we finish with it, the people like you will have to learn it all over again. You think, I dare say, that our chief job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. The 11th edition won't contain a single word that will become obsolete before the year 2050. So I've got this to my notes. He bit hungrily into his bread and swallowed a couple of mouthfuls, then continued speaking, with a sort of pedant's passion. His dark, thin face became animated. His eyes had lost their mocking expression and grown almost dreamy. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Of course, the great wastage is in the verbs and adjectives, but there are hundreds of nouns that can be got rid of as well. It isn't only the synonyms, there are also antonyms. After all, the justification is there for a word which is simply the opposite of some other word. A word contains its opposite in itself. Take good, for example. If you have a word like good, what need is there for a word like bad? Ungood will do just as well. Better, because it's an exact opposite, which the other is not. Or again, if you want a stronger version of the word good, what sense is there in having a word string of vague, useless words like excellent and splendid, and all the rest of them? Plus good covers the meaning, or double plus good if you want something stronger still. Of course, we use those forms already, but in the final version of Newspeak, there'll be nothing else. In the end of the whole nation of goodness and badness will be covered only by 6 words. In reality, only 1 word. Don't you see the beauty of that, Winston? It was BB's idea originally, of course, he added as an afterthought. Sorry, I just saw someone post in the chat and then it says message retracted. I hope that person deleted it themselves and it wasn't censored. It's just a kind of irony to that. A sort of vapid eagerness flitted across Winston's face at the mention of Big Brother. Nevertheless, Sim immediately detected a certain lack of enthusiasm. You haven't a real appreciation of Newspeak, Winston, he said, almost sadly. Even when you write it, you're still thinking in Oldspeak. You've read some of those pieces that you write in the Times occasionally. They're good enough, but they're translations. In your heart you'd prefer to stick to Oldspeak, with all the vagueness and its useless shades of meaning. You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year? Winston did not know that, of course. He smiled sympathetically, he hoped, not trusting himself to speak. Sim bit off another large fragment of dark-coloured bread, chewed it briefly, and went on. Don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly 1 word, and its meaning rigidly defined, and all its subsidiaries meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already in the 11th edition, we're not far from that point, but the process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness will always be a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end, there won't be any need for any of that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is Newspeak, he added with a sort of mystical satisfaction. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Except, began Winston doubtfully, and he stopped. It had been on the tip of his tongue to say, except the proles, but he checked himself, not feeling fully certain that this remark was not in some way unorthodox. Sim, however, had divined what he was about to say. The proles are not human beings, he said carelessly. By 2050, earlier probably, all real knowledge of Oldspeak will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, they'll only exist in Newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. Even the literature of the party will change. Even the slogans will change. How could you have a slogan like freedom and slavery when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought, as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. One of these days, thought Winston with sudden deep conviction, Sim will be vaporized. He's too intelligent. He sees too clearly and speaks too plainly. The party does not like such people. One day he will disappear. It is written on his face. Winston had finished his bread and cheese. He turned a little sideways in his chair to drink his mug of coffee. At the table on his left, the man with the strident voice was still talking remorselessly away. A young woman who was perhaps his secretary, and who was sitting with her back to Winston, was listening to him and seemed to be eagerly agreeing with everything that he said. From time to time Winston caught some such remark as, "I think you're so right, I do so agree with you," uttered in a youthful and rather silly feminine voice. But the other voice never stopped for an instant, even when the girl was speaking. Winston knew the man by sight, though he knew no more about him than that he had held some important job at the fiction department. It was a man of about 30, with a muscular throat and a large, mobile mouth. His head was thrown back a little, and because of the angle at which he was sitting, his spectacles caught the light and presented to Winston 2 black discs instead of eyes. What was slightly horrible was that from the stream of sound that poured out of his mouth, it was almost impossible to distinguish a single word. Just as Winston had caught a phrase, "complete and final elimination of Goldstein," jerked out very rapidly, and, as it seemed, all in one piece, like a line of typecast solid. For the rest it was just a noise, a quacking, and yet, though you could not actually hear what the man was saying, you could not be in any doubt about its general nature. He might be denouncing Goldstein and demanding sterner measures against his thought criminals and saboteurs. He might be fulminating against the atrocities of the Eurasian army. It might be praising Big Brother or the heroes of the Malabar front. It made no difference. Whatever it was, you could be certain that every word of it was pure orthodoxy, pure ingsoc. As he watched the eyeless face and the jaw moving rapidly up and down, Winston had a curious feeling that this was not a real human being, but some kind of dummy. It was not the man's brain that was speaking, it was his larynx. The stuff that was coming out of him consisted of words, but it was not speech in a true sense. It was noise uttered in unconsciousness, like the quacking of a duck. Sorry, I'm gonna get it. I need more drink. My throat. I was talking, drying up my throat. I was talking about this idea with my husband a couple of days ago. We watched that clip you may have seen. It was going around on Twitter of a YouTuber called was it Vaush? How do you say it? Vaush. Vaush. And he's it was during one of his live streams where he was reviewing this video by I don't really know the context. It was a video of women discussing sexual assault, talking about rape culture and such things. And he as you've seen a live stream like this, you know that the person in the live stream is watching a video and they pause it when they want to make a point about it. So he pauses it in the middle of this girl's statement about being abused, and he's pointing out how how incoherent she is out of sort of grief. She's so upset that she's getting, is it Vaush? She's getting upset discussing this topic, discussing what happened to her, and he pauses the video to point out how common sexual assault is and how upsetting it is for these women to talk about it. And then when he presses play, he's never seen this video before, and she immediately talks about how her abuser was she doesn't even mention exactly what it was, but it's obvious what she's talking about. She says that the man was of a certain race and of a certain religion, and that therefore it was difficult to get him prosecuted. The police were hesitant to take up her case because of the race and religion of the attacker. And Vaush immediately goes into he flips 180 degrees and is now attacking this woman who he was just he was just defending her, and saying that it's terrible that women get assaulted, and that that she was so upset about it. And after only just a few extra seconds of listening to her, he flips 180 degrees and is accusing her of stirring up racial tensions and for being anti-immigration. And it's if you haven't seen the clip, it's worth seeing, because it's a real this passage of 1984 just reminded me of that. It's a demonstration of someone who's not thinking with they're not thinking and speaking in the way that a human being naturally does. They're just a dummy. They're just a larynx for an ideology. That's why it's so easy to engage in doublethink, and for to just contradict yourself in the same breath. It comes so naturally because you're not really engaging with your brain. You're just spouting an ideology that's inhabiting you and using your voice to speak. Figuratively speaking, of course. I'm not saying he was possessed by a literal demon. Have a look at the clip anyway, if you're interested. I can't really convey exactly why it was so kind of funny / sad. Sim had fallen silent for a moment, and with the handle of his spoon was tracing patterns of the puddle of stew. The voice from the other table quacked rapidly, easily audible in spite of the surrounding din. "There is a word in Newspeak," said Sim. "I don't know whether you know it. Duck speak, like quack like a duck. It is one of those interesting words to have two contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it is abuse. Applied to someone you agree with, it is praise." Unquestionably, Sim will be vaporized, Winston thought again. He thought it with a kind of sadness, although well knowing that Sim despised him and slightly disliked him. Sim despised him and slightly disliked him. That's an interesting sentence. And was fully capable of denouncing him as a thought criminal if he saw any reason for doing so. There was something subtly wrong with Sim. There was something that he lacked: discretion, aloofness, a sort of saving stupidity. You could not say that he was unorthodox. He believed in the principles of Ingsoc and renovated Big Brother. He rejoiced over victories. He hated heretics, and not merely with sincerity, but with a sort of restless zeal, an up-to-dateness for information which the ordinary party member did not approach. Yet a faint air of disreputability always clung to him. He said things that would have been better unsaid. He had read too many books. He frequented the Chestnut Tree Cafe, haunt of painters and musicians. There was no law, not even unwritten law, against frequenting the Chestnut Tree Cafe, yet the place was still somehow ill-omened. The older discredited leaders of the party had been used to gather there before they were finally purged. Goldstein himself, it was said, had sometimes been seen there years and decades ago. Sim's fate was not difficult to foresee, and it was a fact that if Sim grasped, even for 3 seconds, the true nature of Winston's secret opinions, he would betray him instantly to the thought police. So would anyone else, for that matter. But Sim more than most. Zeal was not enough. Orthodoxy was unconsciousness. Sim looked up. "Here comes Parsons," he said. Something in the tone of his voice seemed to add, "that bloody fool." Parsons, Winston's fellow tenant of the Victory Mansions, was in fact threading his way across the room. A tubby, middle-sized man with fair hair and a frog-like face. At 35, he was already putting on rolls of fat at the neck and waistline, but his movements were brisk and boyish. His whole appearance was that of a little boy grown large, so much so that although he was wearing the regulation overalls, it was almost impossible not to think of him as being dressed in blue shorts, grey shirt, and red neckerchief with the spines. In visualizing him, one saw always a picture of dimpled knees and sleeves rolled up back from pudgy forearms. Parsons did, indeed, invariably revert to shorts when a community hike, or any other physical activity gave him an excuse for doing so. He greeted them both with a cheery "hello, hello," and sat down at the table, giving off an intense smell of sweat. Beads of moisture stood out all over his pink face. His powers of sweating were extraordinary. At the community centre, you could always tell when he had been playing table tennis by the dampness of the bat handle. Sim had produced a strip of paper on which there was a long column of words, and was studying it with ink pencil between his fingers. There's a bee trying to get in the window. Not on my watch. Look at him, working away in the lunch hour, said Parsons, nudging Winston. Keenness, eh? What's that you've got there, old boy? Something a bit too brainy for me, I expect. Smith, old boy, I'll tell you why I'm chasing you. It's that sub you forgot to give me. Which sub is that? Said Winston, automatically feeling for money. About a quarter of one's salary had to be earmarked for voluntary subscriptions, which were so numerous that it was difficult to keep track of them. For Hate Week, you know, the House by House Fund. I'm treasurer for our block. We're making an all-out effort, going to put a tremendous show. I tell you, it won't be my fault if the old Victory Mansions doesn't have the biggest outfit of flowers in the whole street. $2 you promised me. Winston found and handed over 2 creased and filthy notes, which Parsons entered in a small notebook, and in the neat handwriting of the illiterate. By the way, old boy, he said, I hear that little beggar of mine let fly at you with the catapult yesterday. I gave him a good dressing down for it. In fact, I told him I'd take the catapult away if he does it again. I think he was a little upset at not going to the execution, said Winston. Ah, well, what I mean to say shows the right spirit, doesn't it? Mischievous little beggars they are, both of them. But talk about keenness, and all they think about is the spies, and the war, of course. Do you know what the little girl of mine did last Saturday, when her troop was off on a hike out of Berkhamsted Way? She got 2 other little girls to go with her, slipped off from the hike, and spent a whole afternoon following a strange man. They kept on his tail for 2 hours, right through the woods, and then, when they got into the Amersham, handed him over to the patrols. What did they do that for? Said Winston, somewhat taken aback. Parsons went on triumphantly. My kid made sure he was some kind of enemy agent. Might have been dropped by parachute, for instance. But here's the point, old boy. What do you think put her on him in the first place? She spotted he was wearing funny kind of shoes. She said she'd never seen anyone wearing shoes like that before. So the chances were he was a foreigner. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh? What happened to the man? Said Winston. Ah, that I couldn't say, of course. But I wouldn't be altogether surprised if... Parson made the motion of aiming a rifle and clicked his tongue for the explosion. Good, said Sim abstractly, without looking up from his strip of paper. Of course we can't afford to take chances, agreed Winston dutifully. What I mean to say is, there is a war on, said Parsons. As though in confirmation of this, a trumpet call floated from the telescreen just above their heads. However, it was not the proclamation of a military victory this time, but merely an announcement of the Ministry of Plenty. Comrades, cried an eager, youthful voice. Attention, comrades, we have a glorious news for you. We have won the battle for production. Returns have now completed of their output of all classes of consumption goods show that the standard living has risen by no less than 20% over the past year. All over Oceania this morning there were irrepressible, spontaneous demonstrations when workers marched out of factories and offices and paraded through the streets with banners voicing their gratitude to Big Brother for the new, happy life which his wise leadership has bestowed upon us. Here are some of the completed figures. Foodstuffs. The phrase our new happy life recurred several times. It had been a favourite of late with the Ministry of Plenty. Parsons, his attention caught by the trumpet call, sat listening with a sort of gaping solemnity, a sort of edified boredom. He could not follow the figures, but he was aware that they were in some way a cause of satisfaction. He had lugged out a huge and filthy pipe, which was already half full of charred tobacco. With a tobacco ration at 100 grams a week, it was seldom possible to fill a pipe to the top. Winston was smoking a Victory cigarette, which he held carefully horizontal. A new ration... I don't smoke, so I don't know what that means. Okay, I know if you hold something that's on fire, if you hold it upside down, it'll burn quicker. if you hold it the right way up, I guess it goes out. So maybe holding it horizontal is the perfect. Maybe it's just a weird quirk of his. The new ration did not start till tomorrow. He only had 4 cigarettes left. For the moment he had shut his ears to the remoter noises and was listening to the stuff that streamed out of the telescreen. It appeared that there had been demonstrations to thank Big Brother for raising the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week. And only yesterday, he reflected, it had been announced that the ration would be reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that they could swallow that after only 24 hours? Well, they swallowed it. Parsons swallowed it easily, with the stupidity of an animal. The eyeless creature at the other end of the other table swallowed it fanatically, passionately, with a ferocious desire to track down, denounce, and vaporize anyone who would suggest that last week the ration had been 30 grams. Sim, too, in some more complex way involving doublethink, Sim swallowed it. Was he, then, alone in the possession of a memory? The famous statistics continued to pour out of the telescreen. As compared with last year, there was more food, more clothes, more furniture, more cooking pots, more fuel, more ships, more helicopters, more books, more babies, more of everything except disease, crime, and insanity. Year by year, and minute by minute, everyone and everything was whizzing rapidly upwards. As Sim had done earlier, Winston had taken up his spoon and was dabbing in the pale-coloured gravy that dribbled across the table, drawing a long streak of it into a pattern. He meditated resentfully upon the physical texture of life. Had it always been like this? Had food always tasted like this? He looked around the canteen, a low-ceilinged, crowded room, its walls grimy from the contact of innumerable bodies, battered metal tables and chairs, placed so close together that you sat with elbows touching, bent spoons, dented trays, coarse white mugs, all surfaces greasy, grime in every crack, and a sourish composite smell of bad gin and bad coffee, and metallic stew and dirty clothes. Always in your stomach and in your skin there was a sort of protest, a feeling that you had been cheated of something that you had the right to. It was true that he had no memories of anything greatly different. At any time that he could actually remember, there was never been quite enough to eat. One had never had socks or underclothes that were not full of holes. Furniture had always been battered and rickety. Rooms underheated, tube trains crowded, houses falling to pieces, bread dark-coloured, tea a rarity, coffee filthy tasting, cigarettes insufficient, nothing cheap and plentiful except synthetic gin. And though, of course, it grew worse as one's body aged, it was not a sign that it was not the natural order of things. If one's heart sickened at the discomfort and dirt and scarcity, the interminable winters, the sickness, the stickiness of one's socks, the lifts that never worked, the cold water, the gritty soap, the cigarettes that came to pieces, the food with the strange evil tastes, what should one feel it to be intolerable unless one had some kind of ancestral knowledge that things had once been different? He looked round at the canteen again. Nearly everyone was ugly, and would still have been ugly even if dressed otherwise than in their uniform of blue overalls. On the far side of the room, sitting at the table alone, a small, curiously beetle-like man was drinking a cup of coffee, his little eyes darting suspicious glances from side to side. How easy it was, thought Winston, if you did not look about you, to believe that the physical type set by the party as an ideal, tall, muscular youths and deep-bosomed maidens, blonde-haired, vital, sunburnt, carefree, existed and even predominated. Actually, so far as he could judge, the majority of people in Airship 1 were small, dark, and ill-favoured. It was curious how this beetle-like type proliferated in the ministries. Little grumpy men, growing stout very early in life, with short legs, swift scuttling movements, and fat, inscrutable faces with very small eyes. It was the type that seemed to flourish best under the dominion of the party. The announcement from the Ministry of Plenty ended on another trumpet call, and gave way to tinny music. Parsons, stirred to vague enthusiasm by the bombardment of figures, took his pipe out of his mouth. "The Ministry of Plenty's certainly done a good job this year," he said, with a knowing shake of his head. By the way, Smith, old boy, I suppose you haven't got any razor blades you can let me have? Not one, said Winston. I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks myself. Oh well, just thought I'd ask you, old boy. Sorry, said Winston. The quacking voice on the next table, temporarily silenced during the ministry's announcement, had started up again as loud as ever. For some reason, Winston suddenly found himself thinking of Mrs. Parsons, with her wispy hair and the dust in the creases of her face. Within 2 years, those children would be denouncing her to the thought police. Mrs. Parsons would be vaporized. Sim would be vaporized. Winston would be vaporized. O'Brien would be vaporized. Parsons, on the other hand, would never be vaporized. The eyeless creature with the quacking voice would never be vaporized. The little beetle-like men who scuttle so nimbly through the labyrinthine corridors of the ministries, they too would never be vaporized. And the girl with dark hair, the girl from the fiction department, she would never be vaporized either. It seemed to him that he knew instinctively who would survive and who would perish. Though just what it was that made for survival, it was not easy to say. At this moment he was dragged out of their reverie with a violent jerk. The girl next to the table had turned partly round and was looking at him. It was the girl with dark hair. She was looking at him in a sidelong way, but with a curious intensity. The instant she caught his eye, she looked away again. The sweat started out on Winston's backbone. A horrible pang of terror went through him. It was gone almost at once, but it left a sort of nagging uneasiness behind. Why was she watching him? Why did she keep following him about? Unfortunately, he could not remember whether she had already been at the table when he arrived, or had come there afterwards. But yesterday, at any rate, during the 2 minutes' hate, she had sat immediately behind him when there was no apparent need to do so. Quite likely her real object had been to listen to him and make sure whether he was shouting loudly enough. His earlier thought returned to him. Probably she was not actually a member of the thought police, but then it was precisely the amateur spy who was the greatest danger of all. He did not know how long she had been looking at him, but perhaps for as much as 5 minutes. It was possible that his features had not been perfectly under control. It was terribly dangerous to let your thoughts wander when you were in any public place or within range of a telescreen. The smallest thing you could give away, a nervous tic, an unconscious look of anxiety, a habit of muttering to yourself, anything that carried with it the suggestion of abnormality, of having something to hide. In any case, to wear an improper expression in your face, to look incredulous when a victory was announced, for example, was itself a punishable offence. There was even a word for it in newspeak. Face crime, it was called. The girl had turned her back again on him. Perhaps after all she was not really following him about. Perhaps it was a coincidence that she had sat so close to him 2 days running. His cigarette had gone out, and he laid it carefully on the edge of the table. He would finish smoking it after work, if he could keep the tobacco in it. Quite likely the person at the next table was a spy of the thought police, and quite likely he would be in the cellars of the Ministry of Love within 3 days. But a cigarette end must not be wasted. Sim had followed up with a strip of paper and stowed it away in his pocket. Parsons had begun talking again. "Did I ever tell you, old boy," he said, chuckling round the stem of his pipe, "about the time when those 2 nippers of mine set fire to the old market woman's skirt because they saw her wrapping up sausages in a poster of BB? That's actually a I'm guessing that's a reference to Soviet Russia, where someone was arrested and sent to a gulag for wrapping up a fish in a newspaper depicting Stalin. Sneaking up behind her and set fire to it with a box of matches, burned her quite badly, I believe. Little buggers, eh? But keen as mustard. That's the first-rate training they give in the spies nowadays. Better than any in my day, even. What do you think the latest thing they've served them out with? Ear trumpets for listening through keyholes. My little girl brought one home the other night, tried it out on our sitting room door, and reckoned she could hear twice as much with her ear to the hole. Of course, it's only a toy, mind you. Still, gives them the right idea, eh?" At this moment, the telescreen let out a piercing whistle. It was a signal to return to work. All 3 men sprang to their feet and to join the struggle round the lifts, and the remaining tobacco fell out of Winston's cigarette. Okay, my throat's really grating on me now. I need some caffeine to get rid of this headache. Thank you for everyone who came by. I'm really enjoying this book, and I'm glad that there are other people who are here to listen to it. So thank you very much. It's 38 of you right now, and 35 of you liked it. So I'll see you again. I don't think I'll be able to do this during the weekdays. There's just too much going on. But maybe next weekend we can continue with chapter. Which chapter are we on? We can continue with chapter 6. And how much of the book have we got left? We're 21% through it, so in 5 weeks we should finish. So join me next time. Hit the notification bell if you want to get a notification when a stream has started, so then you won't miss any of the book and you can keep up, with as the stream goes on. You won't have to be stuck in the past. You can be here in real time. So yeah, hit notification bell and I'll see you guys soon.